Back in November of 2010, in Vancouver, British Columbia, there was a man walked in a convenience store and used a fake $50 bill to pay for some small thing like a pack of gum. His intent was to pay for that small item with the $50 bill, get the real cash back, and do that multiple times. And once you've done that 4 or 5 or 6 times, you've stolen several $100s. And that's not an uncommon ploy to steal money. That day, November the 7th, there in Vancouver, the cashier behind the register recognized the fake money and refused to sell the man what he asked for, and additionally refused to give him his fake money back. He then turned in, was no longer a customer and became a robber. He forced his way behind the counter and began to get physical with her, and according to police reports, he began to tell her that he was going to rob her. He pushed his way behind the counter, pushed this female cashier, and he would have succeeded, except he did not count on Larry Skopnick. He didn't even notice Larry Skopnick, for Skopnick was in a wheelchair on another aisle on the other side of the store. Skopnick had been in an ATV accident several years earlier and was a paraplegic. From the waist down, he had no feeling. Skopnick, shall we say, intervened. On the closed circuit camera, no sound, but we have the video. Watch what happens next. The one question I had when I watched this video, yeah, sometimes you just got to love justice. I mean, sometimes it just, and the guy who did the robbery, I hope all of his friends see this, because not only did he get foiled, he got beat up by a guy in a wheelchair, and that was nice. And then I'm not really sure what the guy with the floor is wet sign was really doing. I don't really know what he was doing. I think he had taken some NyQuil or something. I'm not really sure, but Skopnick stepped in on behalf of another person, didn't he? Yeah, I mean, to do that, there have to be several things involved in the person stepping in. There has to be a care, there has to be a compassion, but to step in a difficult situation, it requires nerve, it requires passion. And I got to tell you, in some respects, what Skopnick just did in his wheelchair is to some degree what we are called to do on behalf of others as Christians. As Christians, we are called in many cases to set aside our own needs, our own desires, our own wants, and with a passion and a concern and an empathy and a care to step in to intercede on behalf of others. Sometimes, Christians, are you hearing me? Sometimes God's people must intercede passionately to God for the well-being of others. This morning, as we pick back up in our Genesis series, we are going to take a look at passionate intercession. If you have your Bibles with you, turn to the book of Genesis 18. Just in case you thought I'd forgotten about Genesis, we are back on it. We've had several things taking place, some great opportunities in December for concerts, and then as we began January, as we kind of laid out for you some thoughts about the coming year, and now we're back as we step back into the book of Genesis. Here's where we are. We are dead smack in the middle of the life of a man named Abraham. and Abraham's family and all that is taking place with him. We are very, very soon about to look at, here in a couple of chapters at least, about to look at the birth of his son Isaac, the son of promise. We've already seen some of the dysfunction of the birth of Ishmael. And we're seeing again, we set aside a couple of chapters ago, Abraham's nephew Lot. You remember Lot? As Abraham and Lot, as they went across the land, they found that their herds became so big they couldn't share a field, so they had to split up. And Lot headed down towards Sodom, and God honored Abraham, at that time Abram, for what he was doing. Later, Sodom and some surrounding areas would be conquered by several nations from the northern part of Palestine, of that geographical area. And so Abram got 300 of his trained men, took off north, fought a battle, and recovered his nephew Lot and all of his family. In fact, men, in some of our recent prayer meetings, I've talked about some of our men at Green Acres Baptist Church who from time to time maybe fall away. And it happens. I compared our men going after those men much like Abraham went after his nephew Lot. Sometimes it requires us to do it very intentionally with great force and effort as men to go after some of these men who are out there floating around that are out of church, who have fallen away. That's a whole other issue and a whole other message probably, a whole other message, but nevertheless, Abraham went after Lot very intentionally, very aggressively, and brought him back. And so at that point, then Lot kind of goes back into Sodom for some strange reason and moves back down to Sodom. And we don't hear about Lot for a while, but we are about to hear about him again for a couple of chapters. Last message that we looked at in Genesis chapter 18, the setting was Abraham and his wife Sarah were at their tent. 3 men showed up that they understood to be men sent from God. And these men sent from God told Sarah and told Abraham, you are going to have a son of promise a year from now. Bank on it. I'm telling you. In fact, Sarah was so surprised that she laughed out loud thinking, this can't happen. I'm way, way too old for that. I mean, I hadn't even thought about having babies in decades. And so they verified to Abraham and to her that they would have a baby. And at the end of that meeting, those 3 men, according to verse 16, get up and start heading towards Sodom. And that's where we pick up our study. I'm going to read verses 16 through 33 in Genesis chapter 18. And then here's what we're going to find out today. We're going to take a look at some factors of passionate intercession. And watch this. We're going to talk a little bit about what it means to intercede on behalf of other believers, to intercede on behalf of others in ways that is not about me, it's not about what I want, it's not about my needs, it's about going to bat, going to battle, going to war on behalf of other people. Genesis chapter 18, verse 16, then the men rose from there and looked towards Sodom, and Abraham went with them to send them on the way. And the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing, since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I have known him, in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring Abraham what he has spoken to him. And the Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grave, I will go down and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry against it that has come to me, and if not, I will know. Then the men, that is the men who had been with Abraham and Sarah at their tent, then the men turned away from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. And Abraham came near and said, would you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there were 50 righteous within the city. Would you also destroy the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous that were in it? far be it from you to do such a thing as this, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous should be as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? So the Lord said, if I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare all the place for their sakes. Then Abraham answered and said, indeed now I, who am but dust and ashes, have taken it upon myself to speak to the Lord. Suppose there were 5 less than the 50 righteous. Would you destroy all the city for lack of 5? So he said, if I find there 45, I will not destroy it. And he spoke to him yet again and said, suppose there should be 40 found there. So he said, God said, I will not do it for the sake of 40. Then he, Abraham, said, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 should be found there. So God said, I will not do it if I find 30 there. And Abraham said, indeed now, I have taken it upon myself to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 should be found there. And God said, I will not destroy it for the sake of 20. Then he said, let not the Lord be angry. I will speak but once more. Suppose 10 should be found there. And God said, I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. So the Lord went his way as soon as he had finished speaking with Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. And I want you to hold your spot here and flip over to chapter 19. Verse 12. Chapter 19, verse 12. Then the men said to Lot, have you anyone else here, son-in-law, your sons, your daughters, and whomever you have in this city, take them out of this place. For we will destroy this place, because the outcry against them has grown great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. There are times where we are called with passion, with empathy, with concern, to step in and intercede on behalf of others. In this story, we have some very unusual conversation happening. We'll see that more as we go in. God having conversation with what appear to be angels, and God having conversation with Abraham, and the discussion back and forth seems very unusual, but there are 2 truths that seem to hold very clear in this passage. One, by the way, is the justice of God. The justice of God. The other is one man interceding on behalf of others. This morning, as we take a look at this passage, we're going to focus on this. We are going to focus on some factors related to passionate intercession. Some factors that are related to passionate intercession. When has God called you to set yourself aside and step in and intercede on behalf of others, not for your own well-being, not for your own benefit, not for what you might get out of it, but just simply because you want to put yourself on the line for others? Some factors of passionate intercession, picking up in verse 16. And again we read, then the men who rose from there. And if you want to know who the men are, you can look into Genesis 18:2. We won't go there, but I've already explained those were men that had met with Abraham and Sarah to tell them that Isaac would be born. And so these men get up, and it says they look towards Sodom. Now, according to this story, Abraham walks with them just a short span. And then interestingly enough, in verse 17, God speaks. God speaks out loud, and He asks a question. God asks a question, which is always interesting to me, because when God asks a question, He asks questions for very different reasons than when we, human beings, ask questions. If I ask a question, it may be to obtain some information. God never asks an informational question. He knows everything. He's omniscient. When I ask a question, it may be to receive permission. May I use your book? God doesn't ask permission of anyone. He's omnipotent. He owns everything. And so when God asks a question, I'm always intrigued to find out exactly why is it He asked it. And so He says, shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing? It's as if He's counseling with somebody. And when I read through this, to be honest with you, I studied through this quite a bit before it really occurred to me. God is speaking to those men, which were angels, which were His servants. I'm convinced God is speaking to them. And God is counseling with Himself. In fact, in the book of Psalms, it says, who has counseled with God that he might learn from them? Well, the answer is nobody. God counsels with Himself. In fact, in Genesis chapter 1, He says, let us make man in our image. I think it's chapter 1, verse 26. Let us make man in our image. God is counseling with Himself in a sense. And so here, God is asking the question, I suppose, of Himself and quite possibly of those men who were His servants. And here's the question. Shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing? Well, God, what is it you're about to do? Well, the foreshadowing was in verse 16, right? Because those men, they already looked towards Sodom. So God's about to do, if we didn't have anything else, we'd know God's about to do something that has something to do with Sodom. Now, I know in today's culture, especially our church culture, when we mention the word Sodom, our minds automatically go to a great sinful city, right? But if we didn't know any of that, and we were just looking at this passage, we might wonder. Well, look at verse 18. He says, since Abraham shall surely become a great, gadol is the Hebrew word here. It means emphasizes size, great. Abraham's going to have a bunch of people, a bunch of offspring, a bunch of descendants. And he's going to be great and mighty. And the word mighty there emphasizes power. So Abraham is not only going to have a lot of folks in his family tree, they're going to be powerful. That's what Abraham is going to be. And he said, so his reason for even wondering or laying out the question to the men, should I share this with Abraham, has to do with Abraham's future status. And so he says, since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations on the earth shall be blessed in him. For I have known him in order that he may command, charge, direct his children and his household after him. God lays out Abraham's status. He lays out Abraham's power. He lays out Abraham's descendants and all of them. And it appears that God is saying, one of the reasons I would make sure Abraham knows what I'm about to do is because he's privy to the information, right? A need-to-know basis kind of thing. For those here in Warner Robins, this probably is something very familiar to us, especially with all the military and the civilians. There are some people who work at Robins Air Force Base that have a certain security clearance, and there are others who have a higher security clearance, and then there are still others who may be just a handful of them with a certain level of security clearance, and it all depends on your status and what you do, doesn't it? It all depends on where you work and what you need to know. And so your security clearance may be directly tied to your job. And so God is in a sense saying here, because of what Abraham will become, it is necessary that he is aware of what I'm about to do. Not only that, but I'm convinced, obviously God knew how Abraham would respond. And so God lays it out here, but watch this. The intercession that is about to take place from Abraham to God, the intercession that's about to happen where Abraham steps in and tries to help and rescue the people of Sodom. One of the factors it involves is what I call the intimacy factor. The intimacy factor. In this case, more than anything, Abraham's intimacy with God. You see, chances are Abraham would not have even known about the destruction of Sodom had he not been who God made him to be. And because he was who God made him to be, Abraham was privy to more information of what God was doing. I found that to be true as a pastor. Not that I'm anything, but because of my office, there are things that I know, there are things that people share with me that many people don't know. And as a result, God gives me a greater opportunity to intercede on behalf of others than He may someone else who maybe doesn't have all the information. And it doesn't make me special. It doesn't mean personally I'm somehow special. It just, from the office of pastor, it is just inherent to it. And Abraham has this office of sorts, this calling to be a great nation. And because of his intimacy with God, Abraham is called to intercede. I got to tell you something. Just going to warn you. The greater your intimacy with God, the greater your calling will be to intercede on behalf of others. Why is that, Pastor Johnny? Because I'm convinced that if you lack intimacy with God, most spiritual needs just whiz right by. You don't even notice them. You don't even know your own spiritual needs, let alone the spiritual needs of others. Most of them you don't even pick up on. You don't even get a chance. Well, Pastor Johnny, isn't it better than to not be intimate so I don't know? Well, on the front end, that appears to be true. But in the long run, the blessing that comes out of interceding on behalf of others is so much greater than the sacrifice you make. You're going to miss a great opportunity to experience and see when you intercede on behalf of someone and then you see God work in their lives and you see them either come to salvation or get spiritual victory, the enjoyment you have, you miss when you lack intimacy with God. The more you grow in intimacy, the greater your concern will be to intercede on behalf of others. And I got to tell you something. If you go along, if you bop along for weeks at a time without any real thought of interceding on behalf of others, the reason isn't that there aren't great needs out there, because they're always around. I can guarantee you that. The reason may be that you lack such a sensitivity to God's moving that you don't even know what's going on. I think of Jacob. Old Jacob in the Old Testament. You know, when he first left home, he was running from his brother Esau. You remember that? And he stopped at a place called Bethel. The story of Bethel, Jacob goes to sleep and he has this dream that there's this staircase going up into heaven and angels are descending and ascending on it. And God speaks to Jacob there. And I've talked about this as an illustration before, but Jacob wakes up the next morning and he makes a statement. He said, surely God was in this place and I did not know it. Let me tell you about Jacob at that point. Jacob was a man who was in it for himself. Jacob was all about Jacob. Jacob probably referred to himself in the third person. You ever had that happen? That's kind of weird, isn't it? Where you're talking to somebody and they refer to themselves in the third person. There's this sense that they are an island and everything revolves around them. Now, maybe not literally, but I watch people spiritually do this. They're like a black hole. You know, supposedly in the universe, these black holes where these stars have caved in on themselves and they suck everything in. There are these people who are spiritual black holes where they're all about themselves and people that get close to them just kind of suck the life out of them because they're all about themselves. And that was Jacob. But watch this. As Jacob progresses through, later on, Jacob marries his wife. He works 14 years for his uncle Laban. And then he leaves Laban and he comes about to this time in this place where he's going to see Esau, his brother, again for the first time in probably 15 years. The last time he saw Esau wanted to kill him. It's the last time he saw him. So he'd been trying to avoid Esau for some time. And Jacob is faced with this idea. He is about to be confronted with Esau. And it's interesting what he does. Jacob goes across the Jabbok River, and then he sends all of his people and his family to the other side of the river. And here's what Jacob says. Well, if Esau wants to kill me, at least he can kill me and my family will get away. We see the first signs of Jacob willing to sacrifice himself for somebody else. That's not something he was prepared to do earlier in his life because Jacob was all about himself. And so he has this night where he goes to sleep and he wakes up and there's this angel of the Lord that shows up and they start wrestling and Jacob's hip is thrown out of joint and Jacob says, I'm not letting go of you till you bless me. And all this spiritual interaction takes place, and we see progress in Jacob's life. Here's the progress that where before Jacob didn't even know God was there. When he ends up at Jabbok, at least he's aware that it's God. So Jacob has grown spiritually, and part of the proof that he's grown spiritually is that he's concerned for others even beyond himself. And then finally, in Genesis chapter 49, Jacob is dying. Jacob's about to die. And the entire text of Jacob's conversation in Genesis 49 is all about the blessings and the inheritance for his children and his family, and nothing about himself. In fact, he's already back in Egypt at that point where his son Joseph has risen to power. And the king, the Pharaoh, asked Jacob about his life, and Jacob makes this statement. He said, "My days are few and evil." It's as if Jacob realizes what he did wasting years of selfishness. But all of chapter 49, just before Jacob dies, we see a man who cares nothing for himself and only about his family and his kids. You say, "Well, that's easy, Pastor John." You're right, but maybe not so much for a guy who was all in it for himself earlier. Here's my point. The more you grow in Christ, the more you will have an urge and an opportunity, and the more you will even notice the needs of others to intercede on their behalf. It is an intimacy factor. God help us that we would grow in the Lord and become like Abram and know Him so well and have such an intimate fellowship that we're more concerned about the needs. We see the needs of others. We intercede on behalf of others. We call out to God on behalf of others. The more you grow in Christ, the less you'll find you thinking about yourself. The more you grow in Christ, I hear people talking to them about whatever situation they're in, and they say, "Well, Pastor, no one understands my situation. No one understands my situation." Can I very gently and graciously explain to you the translation of that? I am so absorbed in myself, I want to pout about what's happening with me in such a way I don't want anybody to imply that they have as difficult of a situation as I do. That's just a kind of a general translation. But what we find as we grow in the Lord is you become more intimate with the Lord. You're more concerned about the problems of others, and in fact, you begin to see what others are going through is worse than what you're going through. Even if what you're experiencing is worse. You begin to see that the problems of others are worse than yours, are more difficult than yours, concern you more than yours. Even if what you're facing is worse than theirs, you don't see it that way anymore. Growing in Christ, you see others. Jesus Christ hanging on the cross looked down at John and said, "Look, son, behold your mother." Look down at his mother, behold your son. He was more concerned about the future of his mother than he was the fact he was hanging on a cross. Who do you think in that moment had a bigger problem? Jesus or his mom? Obviously Jesus did, but because of his selflessness, he was more concerned about somebody else. And I'm telling you, you will intercede for others more the closer you grow with Christ. You will begin to see the challenges of others as greater than yourself. And you will stop thinking about yourself more, and you will think about others more. The intimacy factor. Look at verse 20. So Abraham has this intimacy with God, and the Lord said, because the outcry, the wailing or distress, it's a distress cry, if you will. Because the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grave or grievous, I will go down and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry against this. Kind of this picture almost that God's not sure He's going to go down and get a closer look. Well, Pastor Johnny, I thought He was omnipresent. He is. This does not imply that God was not omnipresent, but He's speaking to Abraham in human ideas, if you will. He's speaking to Abraham and these servants in ideas that they can, in mortal ideas that they can comprehend. And so the picture is much the same way as the Tower of Babel, where it says that God kind of looked down and said, let's go down and see what they're building. As if God wasn't already there, He's omnipresent. And so verse 22, then the men, these are the three men we were talking about earlier. The men turned away from there and went towards Sodom. They're on their way. They're on their way to have Sodom destroyed. You hear what I'm saying? God's not waiting on a response from Abraham, although He knows it's coming. The men are on their way to bring about the destruction, which leads me to believe that as Abraham begins to intercede, we're going to see it here in just a moment. And even though the men were on their way, you know, it's kind of like the button was already pushed, so to speak. The countdown sequence had already begun. And yet still, there was an opportunity to cry out for others. Can I tell you something? Interceding, passionate intercession, listen to me, passionate intercession will involve not only the intimacy factor, your intimacy with God. Are you ready for the second one? Passionate intercession will also involve what I call the imminence factor. The word imminent means just about to happen, just around the corner. It is right here. It's just about to take place. The imminence factor. That is, I understand that it could be today, it could be tomorrow, that we don't have much time. People who have fallen away from the Lord and are now in a state of apostasy don't have much time. People who have never come to the Lord and are walking out there lost and undone don't have much time. Even Christians, as we go out to walk with the Lord and to grow in the Lord, there's not much time. And so we intercede on behalf of others because there may not be a tomorrow to intercede. It's the imminence factor. But here's the good news. Those three guys were heading to Sodom to destroy, to be the kind of the conduits of destruction. They're also we're going to see later on in a couple of chapters, a few weeks down the road, how they go to Lot and give him an opportunity to respond and get out of it. But they were headed to destroy it. And apparently it's never too late, because in just a moment we're going to see how Abraham steps in. And even though something may be imminent, it's still not too late. Pastor Johnny, you just don't know what I've done. I'm telling you, you got breath in your body, it's not too late. This past week, I was speaking with one of my college roommates and still one of my very best friends. He pastors down in Florida, and we were reminiscing over finals week after winter quarter. Back in those days when we were at Georgia Southern, schools in quarters instead of semesters, and there were 4 quarters a year. And winter quarter ended right toward early to mid-March, just in time for March Madness. So we always remember that the week we were cramming for finals, we would have the TV on all the time, watching every game we could watch, with the sound turned down, obviously, because we needed to study, right? And I remember we would hole up in our apartment, and we would study for hours. And we would study during the day, and then every once in a while one of us had to leave to go take a final and come back and study some more for the next subject, whatever that would be. And then we would study into the night. And we would, there was only one place in Statesboro that was open to eat at midnight, and that was Shoney's. So at midnight we would run to Shoney's for breakfast, and we would come back and keep studying. We'd pull those all-nighters. Now it seems to me that it would have been a better idea to do a little bit more attention to the information as the quarter went along, and then you don't have to study quite as much at the end. But we are creatures of habit, aren't we? And we tend to cram when the situation's imminent, don't we? Now there are some who are better at this, that is going along, studying along the way, so they don't have to cram so much at the end. But by and large, what I experienced, even those who made good grades, and me and my roommates all made pretty good grades in college. But we just always tended to cram right at the end. Why? Because it was imminent. There's a certain amount of attention we put towards something when it's imminent. Maybe it's a presentation at work. Maybe it's a job we have to get done. Maybe it is you were supposed to have your bed made before Mom and Dad got home, and you heard the garage door open, and so you're racing in to get it done. It's the imminence factor. And I'm going to tell you something. As we walk along with the Lord, my prayer is that spiritually we would get a greater sense of the imminence that's in front of us, of lost people dying and going to hell, of saved people who aren't in church anymore, who are drifting along out there, and they need to get back with the Lord because the coming of Christ is right around the corner. And so intercessors will intercede because they understand there may not be a tomorrow to intercede. They will do it today. The imminence factor. And then as we move along, I'm going to skip to verse 25. I'll go back and hit these verses we're skipping, but I'm going to take a look at verse 25 for just a moment. Abraham says this, "Far be it from you, God, to do such a thing, that is, destroy Sodom, as this to slay the righteous with the wicked." That is, God, if there are righteous people there in the city, would you destroy the whole city so that even the righteous get destroyed too? God, that's not just. You know, all of us have had those situations where we've been in the classroom where a couple of people got in trouble, so the whole classroom got in trouble. Never liked that. Not to be critical of any instructors here, educators. Maybe you use that. I never liked that when the whole class got in trouble for a couple of people. But we've all been in a situation where that's happened. I remember back during when I played football, every once in a while, somebody would blow an assignment and the whole defense would have to run. Golly, I hated that. And you wanted to kill the guy who messed up. One person jumped off sides. And part of that was because then you could put pressure on each other. Because that guy knew if I jump off sides, running's the least of my concerns. I'm probably going to get beat up in the locker room afterwards, right? Because everybody got to run. But here's what Abraham's saying. But God, in your context, would you, because of the sin of a group of people, would you then destroy people who aren't sinning altogether with them? Here's the point. Abraham has a very focused intention for his intercession. And he says this, "So that the righteous should be as the wicked, far be it from you, shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" Abraham is declaring the righteousness of God. And his concern isn't even so much for the righteous people of Sodom as it is for the glory of God. Watch this. Intercession will be consistent and ongoing and long-term if our concern is the glory of God. And so that brings me to my third factor, that is the intention factor. That my intention for interceding is not just to help this person, but so that God might be glorified. He says, "Lord, what about your righteousness? Well, would you do this because you are a great and righteous God? I wouldn't want anybody to think you're not." I got to tell you, sometimes when I go into the hospitals, and I go to pray for people. And I know generally we assume, well, let's pray they'll get better. Can I tell you? I don't always pray that, or that's not always my priority in prayer. My priority is not always heal this person physically. Because here's what I know. God can heal you or God can heal me 20 times. But sooner or later, we are going to die. He healed Lazarus, didn't he? Where does Lazarus live now? Oh, wait, he's dead. Jesus healed a lot of people in the New Testament. All those people, they're dead. So no matter how much God heals you physically, ultimately, the thing that really matters is that you are healed spiritually. And you know what matters more than that? That in that healing, God would be glorified. I'm not as concerned for praying that you'd be physically healed for your personal comfort, although I certainly care about that. But I'm telling you, we should be more concerned that God be glorified in what happens. And Lord, what if God comes to me and says, "What if I allowed you to remain ill and that would bring me greater glory?" Are you okay with that? And I'm going to tell you, when we grow in the Lord, we can get to a point of saying, you know what? I can face a greater length of trial if it means God would be greater glorified. And in intercession, what needs to be happening is the motive of our heart is the glory of God. That God would be glorified, that God would be lifted up. And Jesus said, "And if I be lifted up, I will draw all men to myself." You see how this thing begins to work? I'm calling out to God, "God, I'm asking you to move in this place for this person so that you will be glorified. And then, Lord, as you're glorified, more people will be drawn to you, more people saved." It is the intention factor, having intentionality about my intercession. Now go back to verse 23. "And Abraham came near and said, would you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there were 50 righteous within the city. Would you also destroy the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous that were in it?" And you were following as I read it earlier. He goes from 50 to 45 to 40. And on down the line, all the way down to 10, he keeps coming back over and over and over again. In fact, at one point, Abraham says, "Listen, Lord, It's as if part of him says, I can't possibly ask God again, but I got to. It's as if Abraham's saying, you know what? I'm not going to stop till I know there's no chance left. I will not stop. Let me tell you of a factor of good intercession. You ready? It's what I call the insistence factor. I will insist over and over and over again till I know there's nothing left to insist about. I will persevere. I will keep on interceding. I will keep on crying out to God on behalf of this person till I know there's no hope one way or another. Maybe until that person's saved or until they're dead on this earth. Maybe until this thing, there's revival here or I'm gone from this earth. I'm asking you, intercede on behalf of Green Acres Baptist Church. God, bring revival. Pastor Johnny, I've been interceding for 20 years. Keep on. Don't stop until you're dead. And then I give you permission to stop. It's the insistence factor. You know, this weekend is a holiday weekend, isn't it? It's to honor a great civil rights leader who believed that violence wasn't the answer, which boggles my mind. Because if I were treated in many cases like he and many of his friends were at the time, I would want to get even with people physically at times and have a hard time with bitterness and unforgiveness. But Martin Luther King Jr. believed that nonviolent protests were the way. But here's the thing about being nonviolent. It takes perseverance. You understand? Nonviolent resistance takes not one time, not 4 times, not 10 times. It takes 10,000 times over 10,000 years. And on and on. In fact, some of the changes that were made and some of the progress that was made, Martin Luther King Jr. never even got to see. But so much of his success had to do with his insistence. He would not stop. He would not back off. He would not back down till there was no breath left in his body, and eventually that happened, didn't it? But I'm telling you, when we intercede on behalf of others, one key factor is that we don't stop. What's a couple of questions? You don't have to answer. I just want you to think. What's the longest you have seriously interceded for another person? Just think about it. You don't have to answer. I'm just in your minds. Think about it. What's the longest you've interceded in prayer for another person? How about this? Removing your children or your spouse. What's the longest number of years you have interceded for someone? Some of you may be saying, nobody I can think of. I've been praying for my husband for years. I've been praying for my children for a long time. But outside of my husband and my children, I can't think of anybody. How about this? Removing a family connection of any kind. What's the longest you've interceded for someone? I got to be honest with you, parents, and we should pray for our children. You should pray for your spouse. But even lost people have that kind of concern for their children and their spouse. Not that they're praying for their salvation, but I'm just saying there's that kind of concern. I'm going to tell you what Jesus does. Jesus goes beyond that. He not only gives us a deep compassion for our children and our spouse and our family, but He begins to give us the same kind of compassion for people we're not even related to. And we begin to pray for them, and we don't stop. And so it is the insistence factor. What if we got a bunch of people at Green Acres Baptist Church and begin to pray for this community, begin to pray for their neighbors, and we said, we're not going to stop till I die or they get saved. I'm not going to stop till I die or they're in this church building. What if that happened? And then watch this. Verse 33. At the end, when Abraham finally got down to 10 people, and God said, I won't even destroy Sodom for the sake of 10. Look what happens. So the Lord went His way as soon as He had finished speaking with Abraham. And Abraham returned to his place. And it seems like it's over. And in today's storytelling, we might say, and everybody lived happily ever after. Sodom was saved, right? We know that not to be true. Because if you go into chapter 19, we find out in verses 12 and 13. Don't turn there, just for sake of time, don't turn there. But we find out Sodom is destroyed, isn't it? But guess what happens? Lot and his family, at least they escape. Did God act to save Lot and his family on behalf of Abraham's prayers? I mean, Abraham knew that his Lot and his family were there. Could it be? But Pastor Johnny, Abraham did all that praying and God still destroyed Sodom. Wasn't that a waste? You tell me. Because what are you praying for? That God will do what you want? Or are you praying, God, do what will most glorify you? I mean, what are you praying for? Is your intercession all about, God, you need to do what I want my way? Oh, I wouldn't say that. Nobody would actually come out and say that. But by our response to circumstances, we're shouting it to the rooftops. We're praying for someone, we're praying for something, and things aren't working out like we think they should, and we get upset, and we quit on God, or we get mad, or we pitch a fit. And you know what we're saying? I wanted God to work it out my way. And intercession is me praying on behalf of another, not concerned about myself, that God would be glorified in what takes place in their lives. And it's what I call the implication factor. What does your response to it implicate? Because God might answer it in a way you never anticipated. That which you have prayed for very long may come to pass as you have prayed, or maybe it won't. What's the implication there? Are you praying just for what you want, the way you want it? Abraham was praying that God would be glorified. And God will end up destroying Sodom, saving Lot, and so be it. But Abraham wouldn't stop. In December, this past December, a publication called The Star Online, there's an article about an event that took place this last July. I want you to listen to this story. After seeing a TV report about the abduction of 5-year-old Jocelyn Rojas, 15-year-old Tamar Boggs and his friend Chris Garcia decided to grab their friends to comb the Lancaster Township in Pennsylvania. Listen to what happens. On bicycles, Boggs and his friend Chris Garcia spotted little Jocelyn in a sedan and started to give chase on their bikes. She's been kidnapped in a car. They spotted her somehow, and now they're chasing this car on their bikes. The duo pursued the car for 15 minutes, after which the driver gave up and let Jocelyn out of the car. Boggs said, 15-year-old Boggs said, as soon as the guy started noticing that we were chasing him, he stopped at the end of the hill. He let her out, and she ran to me and said she needed her mom. Sometimes it just means stepping out on behalf of someone else with no concern for yourself. God desires that for us. And I'm just wondering, when's the last time you just really passionately interceded on behalf of another in a way that you would not stop, in a way that was to glorify God? If you're not noticing the needs of others, maybe you need to ask God that, because I'm telling you, the more you grow in Christ and intimacy, the more you become concerned about the needs of others than yourself. Because if you've got 300 Christians and 295 are concerned about themselves and 5 are concerned about everybody else, guess what happens? The church begins to run at a spiritual deficit because 295 are looking to take out and 5 are looking to pour in. And so many churches are operating that way. And I'm telling you, we need people who are prepared to intercede and not stop. Here in just a moment, I'm going to pray, and I'm going to invite you to come. But here's what I want to ask you to do. Consider this. Is there someone today you want to call out to God for? I want you to come to this altar here in just a few moments and cry out to God on their behalf. Listen, maybe you've had no concern for anybody else. Maybe you want to come and ask what it means to be saved. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe the problem is you're not concerned about others because the Spirit of Jesus is not in you. I'm going to ask, as Pastor Micah plays and the praise team gets ready to lead, I want to ask you to stand right where you are.